Mainit na pagbati sa inyong lahat. Natutuwa ako, ang saya-saya. Nandito yung mga circa 90 pre-pandemic at saka post-pandemic at talagang powerhouse cast tayo. Meron ditong mga deans, former deans, directors, executive directors, mga officers, mga heads ng associations, of course, yung officers ng mga PSSC member organizations. Maraming salamat po sa pagpunta niyo dito. Ang ipapakilala ko ngayon sa inyo ay isang Lodi. Kung natatanda niyo si Yorme, no, pinauso niya yung mga ganong salita. So Lodi ito, isa siyang puwerpa sa larangan ng agham panlipunan. I got a glimpse of him sometime November 2008 when he delivered a centennial lecture series. Ang title po, When Reforms Don't Transform. At kasama niya yung dalawa pang scholars, si Dr. Cynthia Bautista and Dino Ocampo. It was a state-of-the-art lecture on Philippine education, and listening to him, sabi ko, ang galing ng mamang ito. So impressive po talaga, no? Intense, no? Passionate, confident, and competent in his speech. At makita mo, his lecture really mirrored, no, the rigors of his research. Next time na nagkita kami, I was a representative of the Philippines Communication Society sa Board of Trustees ng PSSC, and he was the chairperson. Ganun din, no? The usual passion, yung resoluteness, ang galing mag-preside over ng meeting, no? At talagang makikita mong maayos yung kanyang time management. So I was also lucky that during his term as a chair, papaalala ko sa iyo yon, Sir Allan, dinelegate mo ako sa Indonesia kahit wala man akong karapatan dahil hindi naman ako member ng EXECOM o ng officers ng PSSC, but thanks for that, no? What I liked during his stint, no, as trustee of PSSC was that marami siyang mga sinolve na problems sa PSSC. I think he even extended his term just so ma-resolve yung mga issues ng PSSC at that time. Then I learned that he is an academician of NAST, one of the few social scientists who made it to that very distinguished group. And I would consult him from time to time as I wanted more social scientists in that prestigious group. He would give me leads and advise me on how we can promote the social sciences. From time to time, he would be requested to provide a foreword of a book or that PSSC was publishing, or be a judge and be a reviewer of our mga papers to be published. We are lucky today to have him, as you know, he was not coerced nor appealed to, no, to be a scientific speaker. He volunteered, no. Siguro nagbabayad siya ng utang niya sa PSSC. But thank you very much, no. Ang kanyang pag-volunteer, of course, brought us a lot of happiness. Knowing that I would introduce the speaker, syempre hinanap ko yung kanyang CV. My God, 60 pages, font 9. Sabi ko, bukas pa ako matatapos kung babasahin ko yung kanyang CV. So I will just present to you a snippet of the many achievements of our scientific speaker. He is a psychologist, an educator who is currently a distinguished university professor and university fellow of De La Salle University, where he heads the Psychology of Hope and Well-Being Research Laboratory. He is a research faculty affiliated with the Social Development and Research Center, Dr. Andrew L. Tan Data Science Institute, and Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. I mentioned earlier that he is an academician of the National Academy of Science and Technology and a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences. His current research focuses on lay theories or cultural ideologies and intercultural processes, social psychological dimensions of socio-economic inequality, poverty, social mobility, social prejudice, and other applied social psychology topics in Asian societies. He has been devotedly practicing as a professional psychologist and is very active in social science organizations since the early years of his academic career, advocating development of scientific research capacity building collaboration across institutions and countries, especially in the Southeast Asian regions. In the Philippines, he was very actively involved in the passage of the Philippine Psychology Act of 2009, which regulates the professional practice of psychologists in the country. He has served as president of the Psychological Association of the Philippines 2004-2008 and chair of the Board of Trustees of the Philippine Social Science Council 2008 to 2012. He was president of the ASEAN Regional Union of Psychological Societies in 2008-2010 and president of the Asian Association of Social Psychology in 2013 to 2015. He was also a member of the International Union of Psychological Sciences Working Committee on the Education of Psychologists. He is the only Filipino who has served as editor of 2 scientific journals listed in the World of Science and Scopus. He was editor of the Asia Pacific Education Research and editor-in-chief of Asian Journal of Social Psychology in 2018 and 2020 to 2020. For the past 4 years, he was included in the list of the top 2% of scientists in the world in terms of scientific impact in all scientific disciplines based on a study done in Stanford University and Elsevier Science. Mahaba pa po pero puputulin ko na kasi mas mahalagang sasabihin niya. Friends, dear PSSC members, ladies and gentlemen, my pride and privilege to introduce Professor Allan Benedict Ison Bernardo. A warm round of applause.
Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Thank you, Dr. Odette. Actually, it feels good to be back, to see some familiar faces. As Odette said, this used to be my home for a long time, many, many years ago. And I'm glad to be back. And it is true that I did volunteer, but there's a story to that. The way Dr. Thompson introduced me, I feel I will disappoint in terms of what I want to talk about. But also the way Odette introduced me, napagod ako dun. Pag naisip ko yung ganun na pala katagal yung ginagawa ko. No? So, but today, the talk is ostensibly about diversifying analytic approaches. This was not supposed to be a scientific lecture. A few months ago, the PSSC, to celebrate its 55th anniversary, organized a forum where I was invited to be in the panel to talk about their journeys in Philippine social science. I wanted to be a part of it, but my schedule did not allow me to. So afterwards, I wrote Dr. Odette. He said, if there's a second part, I want to be in that forum, no? So I can share you what I have to say. So gusto ko lang naman talaga magkwento, no? Tapos sabi nila, okay, schedule ka namin sa scientific lecture. Ayoko namang mag-lecture ng scientific lecture, no? But I kind of put together something so that I will share some of my scientific work. But still, what I want to do this afternoon is share with you some of my reflections about social science in the Philippines. And that's actually, the stimulus to this is that after all these years, I have to tell you that all these years working in Philippine social science, I had a big insecurity. I felt I was not a social scientist. When I was first approached to chair the Philippine Social Science Council, people talked to me, Sinch Bautista, at that time, Don Paderanga. I said, I cannot be chair of PSSC because I'm not a social scientist. I saw myself as a psychologist, a psychological scientist, and I felt like I may not be the proper person to represent Philippine social science. And that was coming from the perspective that the kind of research that I did or what I was doing did not, to my point of view, represent what was the norm in Philippine social science during that time. No? And to add to that, but in a way, they can just do it. There were other social psychologists who served as chair before me. There was, I think, Tati Likwanan chaired the PSSC, and Allan Tan, I think, did, right? You may remember Allan, and maybe even Hani Karandang, maybe Amar Torres. So there were a bunch of psychologists who did serve as executive, chair of PSSC. So I said, okay, but they were actually more social than me in that sense. No, not only did I feel that I was not a social scientist, I also felt I was not very social in that sense. No, but I did take it on, and as Odette said, it was a very wonderful experience for me because it was a place where I could actually engage a variety of social sciences in a forum where there was so much respect and shared agenda and a lot of collegiality. So, but all this time, I still felt, these are strong words, I felt disconnected. It came a point where I felt that the research I did was irrelevant to what many social scientists were doing. And not only did I feel alienated by many social scientists, I felt I was also alienating them. So it might have been mutual, no? And that was like part of the narrative was like in 2012, around 2011, I was already trying to find another place where I felt like I could do my own thing, and I felt like I belong. And I think you know that part of my journey is that I did a Fulbright and then just quickly come back, and then I went to China where I stayed for about 7 years. No? So that is, ayoko namang madrama masyado ito, no? But that was the stimulus actually. And part of the reflection here is that as Odette said, I was elected to the World Academy of Science in 2023. And that was, of course, something I really appreciated. But as you see on the screen, I was the first social scientist from the Philippines to be elected as fellow of the TWAS. And part of me, although I was, of course, very happy of this honor, part of me felt that I thought the Philippine social science community would say, bakit siya? Why him? No? And at that time, I was even if I was already based in the Philippines at that time, when I returned, the pandemic started. So my engagement with the Philippine social science community was still not very active at that point. No, so all these things happening in the year 2023 spurred me to engage in a lot of reflection on why I felt this way about my connections in Philippine social science. No, and to this story, National Scientist Emil Javier actually wanted me to be nominated to the TWAS, even at least I think 10 years before. And I told him, no, I was not ready. And I said, I don't think I should be the Philippine Social Sciences nominee. Okay. Anyway, that's done. So let's deal with it. But this is what spurred my reflections. And my reflections are actually going to structure my sharing with you this afternoon. The outline of the talk, there is a structure so that you know that there's an ending to this story. I'm going to start with some reflections. These are very subjective observations about what I will call methodological orthodoxies in Philippine social science. I will try not to be too provocative. These are just going to be observations, and you may agree and disagree. And I'll be very happy to hear your thoughts about this. And then I'm going to talk about my work that relates to, as said, SDG 4 and SDG 10. Though that's going to be what I will cover. And you will see from the years, this is work that started in the early 1990s. I've been around that long. And so there's a lot to try to summarize. I'm not going to go into any great detail about every specific study. Instead, I'm going to highlight the methodological approaches and my epistemological approach throughout these 30 years and use that as a springboard to connect with these reflections about the methodological orthodoxies. And I will end with some discussions on what I think we should be doing in terms of integrating methodological approaches in Philippine social sciences, particularly if we wish to have a greater impact on the work on SDGs. Okay, does this seem like a reasonable coverage? I'm going to go very fast. And so please hold your thoughts, and I'll be happy to engage you all after the talk. Okay. Now, what do I mean when I say methodological orthodoxy? So some people feel like the word orthodoxy tends to be very negatively laden. And I'm going to suggest that orthodoxy implies some kind of consensus that is maintained sometimes through explicit power. But I think in the case of Philippine social science, the methodological orthodoxies are exercised through soft power. What I mean by that, in terms of like who gets hired in the social science department, who becomes chair, who writes the curriculum, who gets the awards, and so on. So in a way, the whole system acknowledges certain analytic and epistemological approaches through its systems, which are never coercive. But it does happen that in the emergence of certain orthodoxies, certain approaches are intended to change or maybe even diminished in value in order to subordinate them to what may be unintentionally the orthodoxy that I was talking about. As a consequence, there is a discrediting of specific empirical forms. I was doing my work in psychology during the time when certain empirical approaches were deemed to be less appropriate, less important, or even irrelevant, and that certain approaches needed to be embraced more wholeheartedly. And as a result, there is a marginalizing and sometimes even demeaning certain approaches, even within specific disciplines. Now, those of you who've been around longer, you know who you are. You know that our disciplines have gone through some very rough times where some areas are marked with very strong hostilities among groups. And sometimes it's the students who are caught in the crossfire, and that the development of certain areas actually were impeded by these hostilities related to the methodological and theoretical approaches. No? Now, ostensibly, what happens, I think, is that there's an attempt to build strong communities of researchers in the different social sciences, which is not a bad thing. I'm an advocate of building stronger communities of practice in social science research or any kind of research, I think, to ensure that it becomes more sustainable. However, there are, if we try to understand or observe how these communities of practice have emerged, it begins by a focus on a common area of inquiry, of course, whether that is Philippine revolutionary history, Philippine values, governance, corruption, or whatnot. Migration is one of those important areas. But also what brings these communities of practice together is common theoretical or methodological approach. In practice, I believe that these methodological approaches create communities with varying degrees of closure and openness, where some of the groups are very tight, where membership is very well guarded. It's almost like fraternity-like, that it's going to be very difficult to join that particular group. And if you leave, it is with dire consequences, okay? But also, I believe that this is a natural part of the reality of Philippine social science, especially those whose works emerged from the 70s and 80s. It's inevitably, even I will admit, my work draws from very distinct political orientations. No? So these research paradigms are not simply methodological or epistemological. There's always an ideological component to it, and that's not a bad thing. Okay. Now, what is interesting, however, is that there are, okay, can you just help me move forward, please? Okay. There are, I think, some dangers to these communities of practice. And one of them is the possibility of, I use the term balkanization of social science research communities. And balkanization, not only in terms of setting boundaries, but also hostilities among different groups. I see some heads nodding. I hope it's not reflecting some battle scars. No, but we do know that in some social science disciplines, we went through some of this where the hostilities were even very overt. So it's not something we were hiding. No, you have some departments where the faculty was divided into 3 factions, then 4 factions. No, and some disciplines with very clear delineated. And so although there are very strong communities of practice, I felt like the hostility attendant to the different groups maybe not warranted. No? So, and particularly the concern about the balkanization is that it prevents dialogue. it prevents people from having listening ears willing to listen to other social scientists. Okay. Then there is this effect. Now, over the 30 years that I have been working, we see shifts in the curriculum where certain approaches are emphasized and other approaches are minimized or even removed in the training of social scientists. And so over the years, you lose the richness that is actually characteristic of the diversity in social science disciplines. And I think this richness is something we should strive to bring back if we want to have greater impact in the attainment of our social development goals. No? If we were not pressed for time, I would pause and then invite you to talk about your battle scars surviving these hostilities in our social science disciplines. But that can be for another time, and maybe beer is required when we do that. Okay. Now, I am not naive. I think that these hostile aspects of the Balkanization emerge because of a largely inhospitable environment. Okay. Those of you who've been doing research for decades know that we've never had enough resources. Even in the universities, which were supposed to be championing our research, we've always had to compete with areas that were deemed more important. No? Over the years, science, technology, even the economic sciences enjoyed much more support from the people who were supposed to be supporting intellectual activity, and social sciences kind of had to fight for the crumbs. We've always had to fight for legitimacy and attention to do their work. And so with the limited resources, what I thought was like there was such a small pie and people were kind of had to fight for their legitimacy and assert for the resources, the very limited resources that were available. No? So when I talk with my colleagues about why Philippine social science tends to be, fragmented in this way. We have different theories. Some were gendered theories, some were really more economic theories. But it was a different time. Those of you who were there in the 1980s, 90s, no, that the environment in which we were operating was toxic, right, to some degree, and that one had to find ways to rise above the hostilities attendant. And these hostilities had the guise of being very academic, that it was about methodology, it was epistemology, right? But yes, it was all that. But I guess my reflection is, does it really have to be that way? Okay. No, but it was in this environment where I was trying to do what I was trained to do, which was psychology. And even within psychology, I see my colleagues here, I was not the most social of psychologists. No, I was trained as a cognitive psychologist and cognitive scientist, which is as far from social as you can be. And that is why from the time I started doing psychology research in the Philippines, that feeling of being disconnected and irrelevant was very, very strong. And then I ended up just embracing my irrelevance, actually, just so that I can continue doing my work. No? So it is in this context that I will begin to share the work that I have been doing and but that working on this talk made me feel old, because then I started recollecting the things that I've been doing, and I've been at it for over 30 years now. And I'm going to sample the work that relates to education and socioeconomic inequalities, although I do a bit more than that. And I feel like these are the things that I just had to embrace my irrelevance and just do what I wanted to do in order to do what I did. Okay. So I'm going to begin by some work that I did. This was in the 1990s. No? I did this work under the UP Education Research Program. This is a project of the Literacy Coordinating Council and the DEXPANON, DEX Bureau of Non-Formal Education. No? So the concern at that time was functional literacy. So I was with a big team. This was headed by, the late Maludo Ronila. Some of you probably remember her. No? And everyone else in the team was in education. So we're developing curricula, teacher training programs, assessing literacy, particularly in the non-formal education sector. And then for some reason, Malu wanted me to be part of the team. I don't know why. And then so I said, but just let me do what I want to do. So because I was trained as an experimental psychologist, I had to start with an hypothesis. And the hypothesis I was working on was that the acquisition of literacy skills allows individuals to develop higher order thinking skills because it frees them from having to rely on short-term memory for processing information. It kind of liberates part of the brain to engage in higher order thinking processes. That's not a very novel idea in my circles at that time, but we wanted to provide evidence for this to support the non-formal literacy programs of the BNFE at that time, no? So what I did, what Malu was so generous to allow me to do was to conduct an experiment, so to speak, where I compared individuals, adults who and these adults were in communities with low literacy rates in Luzon. So there's a municipality in Ifugao, Zambales. We also went to Rizal, Sorsogon, and Bicol, and one of the barangays in Quezon City. And we sampled individuals who were functionally illiterate, individuals who were illiterate and they acquired it in elementary and then they reverted to illiteracy, and then individuals who were literate functionally. Okay, so and then what I did was we tried to also identify factors that would differentiate these communities. And one of the important factors that I was able to identify was the degree of literacy integration in the communities. I'll explain this a bit later on. No? But what we did here to test the hypothesis was to test their abstract functioning, things like logical reasoning, syllogisms, definitions, etc. No? These were localized types of tests. No? But contrary to the hypothesis, we did not find that individuals who were literate were more abstract in their thinking. So there was no evidence for the hypothesis that literacy acquisition would lead to more abstract, higher order thinking. But instead, and perhaps more interestingly, the level of thinking varied as a degree of the literacy integration in the communities. In particular, the persons who displayed higher order cognitive skills or characteristics were those in the communities where literacy was very much integrated into their community practices. For example, there was this fishing community in Rizal. I'm not going to tell the specific community, where there were NGOs who developed literacy programs with fisher folk, and they integrated literacy activities in the cooperatives, in the livelihood programs, like developing newsletters. Everyone in the community was writing bits of their narratives. So it wasn't just a literacy program, they were developing literacy practices within their organization. So that was, I feel, the most important finding. And when the ADB funded this study, and they said, yes, we now understand what it means to develop literate communities. It's not just developing literacy skills in individuals. It has to be to develop literacy practices in the core activities of the community, whether it's fishing, entertainment, their fiestas, etc. It has to be integrated in the community. Now, sorry, this study, we did this in 1995. But as Dr. Thompson mentioned earlier, the problem of literacy is still very real in our country. And I'm not going to be surprised if the degree of literacy integration in the community is still an important factor that limits the impact of literacy programs in different parts of the country. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing here. The next body of research I want to talk about is my research on language and learning of mathematics. This was very close to what I was trained to do in my PhD. And so I was doing a lot of studies on the effects of the first and second language in learning mathematics. The topic that is, most hated, but also in a way very important in terms of developing functional literacy skills in the country as well. Now, so just very quickly, although the question was, do students learn math better in the first or the second language? The evidence was actually quite mixed, but in a meaningful way. So for example, in several studies, we found a language proficiency effect. That is, the acquisition of the mathematics skills were acquired better when it was done in the child's more proficient language, the mother tongue, whatever that is, okay? But in some cases, it was not the mother tongue that made the difference, but some consistency in the use of the language. At some levels of mathematical problem solving, it almost did not matter what the language of the student was. What was important was what was the language of training. So in other words, in terms of like transfer and basic numeracy practices, as long as there's consistency, then the students are able to perform better. In other cases, some people don't like this effect, language did not make a difference. So in a sense, in the more abstract components of mathematical problem solving, language doesn't make any difference. Now, this is not, I don't want you to see that this is random, no? But what I want you to see is that if you put this all together, language plays a more important role in the more conceptual and entry-level requirements of mathematics learning. Once they're able to hurdle the more conceptual aspects, then what is more important is consistency. And at the highest, most abstract level of math, language doesn't make a difference anymore. Okay? Now, you notice that this was started doing this work in the 1990s. I got tired and stopped doing this in 2005. And the debates are going on until now. You know, it is as if we did not learn from all that research. I was actually, to be honest, I was quite pleased because the mother tongue based multilingual education policy is something that I contributed for, and that was enshrined into law, and it was in place. So I said, okay, yeah, they've started listening to research and they've implemented it. And then now, that policy is, in danger of being reversed. And again, people are debating again what language to use in learning. So now you know why I feel tired about all these things, okay? Now, I'm so happy that I have colleagues who are still fighting in terms of this issue. I'm going to shift to more recent work. Dr. Tongson mentioned about the PISA. So when the results of the PISA came out in 1999, 1999, my research group started jumping at it. And so just for example, one of the sexy topics about PISA was the growth mindset. Have you heard about that? So a lot of people are making money from that concept. And it's something that seems to be emphasized by the developed world. No, the OECD decided to measure the growth mindset, and that's why it's supposed to be important. I did never like that concept, but I felt like, okay, maybe I should try to say something about this. And one of the factors that I felt was being neglected would be the social environment in which learners are actually trying to improve themselves. So one of the hypotheses that I tested was whether the so-called growth mindset benefit actually is robust across socioeconomic groups. So using the PISA data from 2018, I just did kind of routine statistical analysis to test whether socioeconomic status was moderating the growth mindset effect. Oh, I should tell you, one of the things that made this interesting was the Philippines is one of those countries with the highest percentage of students who had no growth mindset. So over 60 or even over 70% of Filipino students reported that they think they could not do anything to improve their intelligence. So they agreed that their intelligence is fixed. These were 15-year-olds. No? So now, those who believe that they could do something about the intelligence, overall, they did tend to have higher educational achievement until we started analyzing them by income groups. And you will see there in that simple analysis there, the line below is flat. That would be the students from low socioeconomic brackets. And you will see that there was no effect of growth mindset. It did not matter what mindset they have. The growth mindset only benefited those from higher socioeconomic groups. Now, for me, that was kind of obvious. No? Even if you believe you can improve your intelligence, if the environment doesn't provide you with the necessary support and resources to do that, that belief is useless. Okay? So I really do not like these here I go again, I'm alienating people, no, that these efforts to just try to build the growth mindset will lead to improvements in achievement is not going to happen if there's no environment to sustain that. Okay. Now, aside from socioeconomic status, so we did this in reading, math, science, no, but I had an even more interesting hypothesis where I thought that the pervading social norms and beliefs are also going to constrain the benefits of the growth mindset. Now, I was working with this concept of social actions, in particularly social complexity, where it's the belief that individuals have that behavioral outcomes may vary. So the opposite of that is that, you know, if there's a social problem, there are actually many different ways of approaching it. In some ways, sometimes one approach is successful, sometimes it's not. So in other words, it's assuming that the pathways to solving social phenomenon is complicated. It's not something that is easily controllable. And the hypothesis I posed was that the growth mindset effect will be weaker in societies where social complexity is a very strong social norms. Why? For example, if social pathways are diverse and there's no clear solution to one type of problem, the desired outcome, which may be higher educational achievement, may be attained through different processes. In other words, my improving my intelligence is not the only pathway of succeeding in education. Maybe I'll just be friendly, or my parents will need to be nice to our teachers and principal. Okay, so there are other pathways to academic success, or for that matter, more broadly, maybe the students think succeeding in school is not actually the only pathway to my own personal success. Okay, which is very real in countries like the Philippines. You can be very successful even if you don't succeed in school. We know that. We have many narratives of that in our country. So that in a country where social complexity is a norm, maybe even educational success is not where growth mindset is going to have an impact. Okay. So how do we test this? Here you go. Okay. This is where I stopped making friends in the Philippines. In this type of analysis, we looked at data from 39 countries where we merged data on social actions and the PISA data, and we did multi-level structural equation modeling. And the model here shows both individual effects and country level effects. Even if I know you love numbers, I will just condense it that basically what you see is we find the growth mindset effect. But the growth mindset effect is much weaker in countries like the Philippines where social complexity norms are high. Okay? Now, so okay, we can talk about this later on if you're really interested, but I'm going to move forward because I like this too much. I might waste your time. No? So after that, this one is a bit more interested and kind of connects to the early work we did on functional literacy. One good thing about the PISA is that it actually provided a lot of data on the family environment and the social environment of students and even in their psychological well-being. So there was a lot to be working on. And so what I did with some of my collaborators was begin to look at kind of the non-obvious predictors of achievement. No? And also, we decided to go beyond the more standard statistical approaches. And I work with data scientists in this project where what we tried to do was to use machine learning approaches to identify the students who were performing poorly. No? So we were not interested in the achievers. Why? Because there are too many who were performing poorly. And we wanted to know, so we didn't want to simply see them as kind of leftovers. No, we wanted to see what are the characteristics of those who are really in the lowest of the low. Because if we understand what contributes to their grouping, then maybe those would be the important factors where we intervene. Okay? I'm not going to go through the details of the methods, but this is kind of, those of you are familiar with data analytics, we kind of prepare the data, train the data, and then try to validate and find out the best model fit. No? And I'll just give you an example of some of our findings very quickly. If you look at the factors that predict the poor readers, you know, socioeconomic status is one of the strongest predictors, and that should not be surprising us, right? But if you look at the constellation of other factors, some are less obvious. Like very simply, this was before the pandemic, already access to ICT was a strong predictor of achievement. But a lot of psychological variables like their motivation to achieve, their aspirations, are do they plan to go to college? No? What types of jobs do they aspire for? Whether they enjoy reading at home, things like that. But also in several studies, it was quite an outstanding finding that the students who performed poorly tended to report very low sense of belonging in the schools. They were there, but they had no sense of belonging with the school. They also tend to report more experiences of bullying and also perceive low cooperation in the school environment. Now, we don't usually talk about these things. We talk about teacher training, the curriculum, no congestion in the classrooms, but there are a lot of social and psychological experience that characterize the experience of those poorest performing students. And therefore, we try to make sense of this in our research group by looking at it. This is how we make a story out of that. That the learner who comes from low SES families are already bringing lower resources, lower cultural capital into the classroom. And together with that, their motivational sets to achieve, their sense of purpose, their valuing for schooling, their aspirations for professional life after school is already impaired. And then they go to classrooms where teachers are not very enthusiastic, and there's very harsh feedback from the teachers about how badly they're doing. And as a result, in the broader social environment, they experience things like bullying, low sense of belonging. If you look at these predictors, it's not curriculum. Oh my goodness, I have just 10 minutes left. Okay, I'm gonna talk fast, sorry. But you see what's happening is that there's a whole environment that creates motivational sets that make students disengage from what's going on in school. They're in school, but they're really not there. They're not doing what they're supposed to. And I think this is why they're not performing well. It doesn't matter what the curriculum is from my point of view. Okay. Now, just here, I'm going to talk about work. Really, I do work on inequalities. I'm going to give you like just two snippets. As a social psychologist, I've started looking at social beliefs that are barriers to to addressing socioeconomic inequalities. No, in social psychology, we do have what they're called system justifying beliefs. These are beliefs that people have that make them turn their eyes against social hierarchies. No, they think that there's a reason why there are inequalities. No, and some of them are related to how people attribute social mobility, who succeeds, who is poor. I'm just going to give you one of the studies that I published recently. And here is something very benign, like the belief in meritocracy. Belief in meritocracy is not a bad thing. Like we like to practice meritocracy in our organizations. But the theory that I'm working here is that the belief of meritocracy is sometimes used to justify social hierarchies, so that those more disadvantaged in the lower ranks are said, well, kasi tamad, no? They're not doing what they're supposed to. We hear that a lot, no? And that even those who are upwardly mobile attribute it to their own hard work and their own capabilities. And you see that in study one, this was a more correlational study where you look at the line that is, the dependent variable here is actually intolerance towards income inequality. So we gave them inequality statistics and just how disturbed are you? And here you see in that sloping line, those who have higher meritocracy beliefs were less bothered by inequality. Okay? Now, however, that is only found among individuals who were higher in the socioeconomic status. Among those in the lower socioeconomic status, meritocracy, they know how it is. No, they know how meritocracy doesn't make that much a difference. Then we did it. I did it. Took one step further. Where I actually did an experiment where momentarily we primed individuals in terms of making meritocracy very salient in their minds. And even for a few minutes, when people are thinking of meritocracy, they become more tolerant of inequality. Okay, so many Europeans like this finding, but Filipinos don't read this. Okay, now I'm going to spend the last minute of this part talking about a project that we're about to launch, where This is measuring the impact of aspiration interventions on economic and psychosocial well-being in the Philippines. Now, a little bit of a background here. I started talking about this in terms of the social psychological barriers to inequality. There's a lot of interventions now. A lot of it is ODA interventions, so trying to address poverty in many of our rural areas. Okay? Graduation programs is one of those that have very good evidence. However, there is also social, psychological, and economic research that tends to show that as people move up the socioeconomic ladder, they become more individualist. That means they lose the sense of community. And we feel that that is a factor that we need to guard against. Yes, we want to lift people out of poverty, but we do not want that side effect of making them less communitarian as a process. Because let's face it, we've had those relatives na nakaangat-angat lang, nakalimot na. Okay? And they start blaming the relatives who are not doing well. So what we're doing here is that we're doing aspirations interventions in different communities where, okay, that's what I was talking about. We want to mitigate that. I'm sorry about what we're doing here is we're doing aspirations interventions in several barangays in Western Visayas where we try to moderate the type of aspiration intervention, one that highlights the more individual effort as opposed to the one that also highlights the community collaborative spirit, the bayanihan spirit, okay? So we are interested in how these interventions might affect things like household and individual economic mobility, a lot of those variables there. And this is something I'm doing with, this is a project under the Innovations for Poverty Action, and my collaborators are these people from Michigan, London School of Economics, Northwestern. And we will be launching this project in about 2 months. And the target is about 8,000 women and 315 barangays in Western Visayas. We've done with the piloting, and then part of the design is some of the women will be invited in a graduation program by the International Care Ministries. And we want to see whether the interventions can have an impact both on the social and then economic outcomes. No? This is going to be couched in a 20-year study, okay? And I will be retired by then. No, but we will have some results ready by next year and maybe in the follow-up in about 2 or 4 years. No, so now this is in a way that's as a nutshell as I can get. For the last 30 years, I've been doing a lot of quantitative research, experimental, standard statistical, machine learning. And my work tends to use psychological theorizing. It ends up being very social and cultural. No? My theorizing actually has implications for these two SDGs. No? And while working on this talk, I actually found a review of my work from way back. This was a review of Smythe of my book from more than 20 years ago. And I think she was very correct. And if I may read, his research is innovative in its marrying of quantitative research approaches with locally developed assessment strategies. He bases his study in psycholinguistic and developmental theories and arrives at sociocultural conclusions. I wonder, however, if he had reviewed existing sociocultural research documenting and defining arguments for literacy as social practice, would he have carried out the same study or perhaps look for something different? I was also in my own silo. So in a way, in my attempt to just get on with what I want to do, I, intentionally was crafting my own research group in this area. And Smythe was correct. If I had cast different questions in the beginning, if I had engaged different communities of the Philippine social science environment, I may have had different questions to pose. Okay. And this is where all this reflection is going on. And I will end by advocating methodological pluralism and integration. Not just pluralism, I think the integration is very important when we talk about SDGs. This was actually a study done by Boyack and colleagues mapping the backbones of science from 2005. So this was more than 20 years ago. And even then, you would see that the social sciences were a very broad and loose clustering of disciplines. You will see on the right that the connections of the disciplines are kind of varied, no? So here, for example, I know you can't see it, but psychology tends to be closer to the medical sciences, right? But economics would be closer to the mathematical sciences, for example. And there you have big hubs there, like sociology is here, close to what communication is doing. No? So there really is, even globally, there are really hubs of social sciences, plural, which are also characterized by different methodologies, among others. No? But notice, they still cluster, right? They're still in the same quadrant. Okay? And it is still an identifiable cluster. And I think we have to embrace this, no? Instead of trying to push certain methodological orthodoxies, it may be right to begin. I think it's time that we acknowledge the richness of our diversities. Now, this is something, this is something that was required reading for my students 20 years ago. No, I just unearthed it. It's not, I think it's outdated, but it's still very useful in terms of locating our own methodologies. So in other words, they're all there. One is not superior than the other. They have very different stories to tell, and they have different bases of knowledge that can contribute to the broader problem. No? But I think it's not enough that we acknowledge the plurality of our methodologies and the theories. We need a framework where we can begin integrating. Okay, that's not easily done. Okay, the fact that we acknowledge sociologists do things differently, political sciences do things differently, public ad people do their work differently is not enough. We need to very resolutely create frameworks that will force us to begin integrating. And a lot of this is actually going to have to be complementation. What our methodologies cannot do can be answered by the methodologies of anthropologists and sociologists and so on. So, because all of our approaches are inherently limited. Descriptive studies will always be limited in scope and specificity, but their richness is also something that we should value. Explanatory studies of the more experimental sciences are always limited in terms of their variables that they consider. But the precision and what they allow in terms of attributing causal mechanisms is something that is also important, especially in looking at long-term longitudinal processes. Prescriptive approaches, especially now with AI and machine learning, is also, it's not very smart, no, because it's all data. No? And therefore, they are limited in terms of the conceptual scaffolding. And in countries like the Philippines, it's always limited by the quality of data that we get. It's garbage in, garbage out. No? So I think that it's the complementarity that we need to work on. And this is like the perfect place I want to tell this story. No? PSSC is the venue for social scientists always come, not just because Dr. Odette gives us good food and coffee, but the multidisciplinarity of PSSC has been there for 50 years. And it has actually been leading in terms of trying to advocate multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. But I think this was not easy to say as a young social scientist in the Philippines in the 1990s. No? There's a lot of humility that is needed in order to engage in multidisciplinarity, humility and respect. And when you're in an environment that doesn't give support, humility is not easy to surrender, and respect is also begrudgingly accorded. No? But we're at a different time now, I'd like to think. And this respect and humility would probably help us acknowledge with humility the limits of our own knowledge and perspectives, and then motivate us to seek complementarity in our work. No? I'm not being naive here. I'm not proposing you that framework. I don't know that framework yet. And I feel like that's something we should be talking about. But also part of what we could be doing is further enriching our methodological and analytic approaches. I don't know who the CHED people are here, but in our respective curricula, maybe it's time to begin reflecting about what are the types of analytic skills that we are training our students. I never stop learning analytics, and someday I have to because I want to retire. No, but it's sort of like I'm able to do more and more work because I have to learn new analytics. And when I feel like I cannot, I find people who can work with me. Now, some of the more complex work I do are younger people, more energetic, and who have more powerful computers than me. I also think we can begin learning from other sciences. My engagement with a data scientist is quite illuminating, but also engagement with people in the medical and health sciences also. And some of the engineering sciences, I'm kind of very promiscuous about my associations, which often ends up not in good things, not always, no. But also learning from other countries. I couldn't help but when I reflect on PSSE programs, even when I was the chair of the board, we tended to be very national. We have the National Social Science Congress, when we invite speakers, it's always Filipinos. Even when they're abroad, there's always a Filipino link. No, unlike other of our social science disciplines, which have had a much more stronger initiative to internationalize, knowing the risks involved, of course. No? And I think we need to do more work of scale. There is value in looking at context and the richness of the data we can get. But in order to really get big picture propositions that address SDG, we need scale, because we need scale to appreciate the heterogeneity of the experiences of our peoples and the specificities as well as generalities in the social knowledge that we generate. No? So PSSE is not late. It's been leading in the multidisciplinary efforts for a long time. However, PSSE, I think, and I'm talking to the right people here, can also reflect on maybe I am part of it, have abetted these orthodoxies for good and for bad. No? So we have to reflect on that. And I think we have to be more proactive in leveraging the benefits of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. The council of PSSC is really unprecedented. Other than the NRCP, I think these are the two bodies where the multidisciplinarity can really be enriched, deepened, and enhanced. No? And I think these are the bodies that can actually do the real work of coming up with that framework. If I was kidding myself. If I had more time, I would have proposed the framework, but I'm not going to kid you. I don't know that framework. I am very motivated, but I think it